Thank you for joining us on this look at the life of Alexander the Great. Before we begin, please consider subscribing to our channel for more sleep stories from history. Your help means the world to us. Alexander's story begins not in Athens or Sparta, the heartlands of Greek civilization, but in Macedonia. To many city-states further south, Macedonia was a strange hybrid. Greek in language and tradition, but rougher, less polished, more warlike. Its people were horsemen hunters and warriors, owing loyalty to their kings rather than to civic assemblies. It was here, in the royal palace at Pella, that Alexander came into the world. His father was Philip II, king of Macedonia, a man of extraordinary ambition and talent. Philip had transformed his kingdom from a fragmented backwater into the most powerful state in Greece. Through cunning diplomacy and brutal warfare, he had secured Macedonia's dominance. He was a general of vision, reshaping his army into a disciplined machine. The famous Macedonian phalanx, with its long spears called sarissas. By the time of Alexander's birth, Philip was already feared and respected across Greece. Alexander's mother was Olympias, a princess from Epirus, a neighboring kingdom. She was fiercely proud, deeply religious, and fiercely protective of her son. Later traditions, half history and half myth, claimed that on the night of Alexander's conception, Olympias dreamt of a thunderbolt striking her womb, while Philip dreamed of sealing her belly with a lion. Such tales, embroidered after Alexander's rise, fed into the belief that he was destined for greatness. Some even whispered that Zeus himself, king of the gods, was his true father. Whether or not people believed these claims, they reinforced the idea that Alexander was touched by divinity. From the start, Alexander's upbringing combined strict discipline with stories of heroes. Macedonia was a kingdom that lived and breathed war, and every prince was expected to fight. Yet Alexander was no ordinary child. He showed an intensity that startled those around him, quick to anger, passionate, but also unusually thoughtful. He grew up hearing the great epics of Homer. One story, told by the historian Plutarch centuries later, illustrates Alexander's nature. When a magnificent horse named Bucephalus was brought to Philip, no one could control it. The animal reared and kicked, throwing off every rider. Philip dismissed it as useless, but Alexander saw something others had not. He noticed the horse was afraid of its own shadow. Slowly, carefully, Alexander turned the stallion towards the sun so the shadow fell behind. Speaking gently, he stroked the animal, mounted it and rode it across the field. The court gasped, and Philip is said to have wept with pride. "My son," he declared, "you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." Whether or not the tale happened exactly as told, it captures something true about Alexander's character: bold, observant, confident, and unwilling to accept limits. Bucephalus became his companion for life, carrying him through countless battles, and symbolizing the bond between man and beast, control and wildness. Education was central to Alexander's preparation for rule. Philip, who valued learning as much as war, brought Aristotle to Pella to tutor his son. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander studied philosophy, science, medicine, and politics. He learned about the natural world, dissecting animals, studying the stars, and discussing the principles of ethics. But Aristotle also reinforced the idea of Greek superiority, teaching Alexander that Greeks were destined to rule over barbarians. This belief would shape the young prince's worldview, even as he later embraced elements of other cultures. Yet Alexander was not simply a student of books. He debated fiercely, questioned assumptions, and showed a restless curiosity. He asked Aristotle whether courage was greater than wisdom, whether kings should obey laws or stand above them. These were not idle questions. They revealed the tension between philosophy and ambition that would define his life. He wanted to learn, but above all, he wanted to act. From his father, Alexander learned the art of command. Philip often took him on campaigns, allowing him to observe strategy and diplomacy firsthand. By his teens, Alexander was already leading troops in battle. At 16, when Philip was away, Alexander was left in charge of Macedonia as regent. In his absence, a rebellion broke out. Alexander responded decisively, crushing the revolt, capturing the town, and naming it Alexandropolis, his first act of stamping his name upon the world. The bond between father and son, however, was complicated. Philip admired Alexander's ability, but also feared his pride and temper. The court at Pella was a nest of intrigue, full of rivalries and jealousies. Philip's marriages created tensions, especially when he married Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian noblewoman, threatening Alexander's claim to the throne. At one banquet, an insult to Alexander's legitimacy led to a furious confrontation. Drunk with rage, Alexander hurled his goblet at his father, and Philip staggered forward, attempting to strike him, only to collapse in his cups. The young prince stormed out, his relationship with Philip badly strained. In 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated during a festival at Aegi. The killer Pausanias, a royal bodyguard, stabbed him to death as he entered the theatre. The reasons remain debated: personal grievance, political conspiracy, perhaps even Olympia's hidden hand. Whatever the truth, the outcome was clear. At 20 years old, Alexander suddenly found himself king of Macedonia. The transition was perilous. Philip's death could have torn the kingdom apart. Enemies within and without saw an opportunity to strike, but Alexander acted with ruthless speed. He eliminated rivals, secured the loyalty of the army, and asserted his authority. He was no longer the fiery prince. He was now the ruler, hardened, calculating, and prepared to inherit his father's unfinished dream, the conquest of Persia. The boy who had tamed a wild horse, studied with philosophers, and fought alongside hardened warriors, was now ready to begin the journey that would make him a legend. Alexander's origins were steeped in myth, but his future would be carved in blood, iron, and ambition. At 20, he stood on the edge of greatness, the world waiting to be conquered. From the moment Alexander could walk, his world was shaped not only by swords and politics, but by ideas. His father Philip understood that the destiny of kings did not rest only on the battlefield. It rested also on the mind, the ability to command men not only through force, but through vision. For this reason, Philip invested in his son's education as much as his military training, surrounding him with the finest tutors of the age. In doing so, he gave Alexander a foundation that would fuse philosophy with ambition, knowledge with action. The young prince would learn to ride and fight, but also to think, to question, and to imagine a role for himself that transcended the limits of Macedonia. This blend of intellect and fire would shape the man who would later stride across continents like a figure of legend. Even in his earliest years, Alexander displayed a restless curiosity. He asked questions constantly, often in ways that tested the patience of those around him. What lay beyond the mountains? Why did storms break suddenly across the plains? Why did men obey kings rather than gods? His nursemaids and tutors did their best to provide answers, but soon his appetite for knowledge outgrew them. Philip saw in his son not only a boy hungry for glory, but a boy hungry for meaning, and he resolved to provide a teacher who could match his spirit. In an age when Greece was alive with thinkers, poets, and philosophers, there was no better choice than Aristotle, the brilliant pupil of Plato, and one of the most celebrated intellectuals of the time. When Aristotle was summoned to Pella, it was not merely as a tutor, but as an architect of the prince's mind. He was granted an estate at Mieza, away from the distractions of the court, so he could instruct Alexander and a select circle of companions. Among them were boys who would later become some of his most trusted generals, Hephaestion, who would be his closest companion and confidant, Ptolemy, who would later rule Egypt, Cassander, who would one day claim Macedonia, and many others whose names would be written into the story of empire. These boys learned together, fought together, argued together, and grew bound by ties that would later be tested on campaign. But at this stage they were students, united under the stern gaze of a philosopher, determined to shape kings. Aristotle's teaching was broad, covering nearly every subject known to the Greek world. He taught Alexander natural philosophy, the study of plants, animals, and the elements. He encouraged him to dissect creatures, to observe carefully rather than accept myths, and to think of the natural world as a system that could be understood. Medicine was part of this training too, and Alexander developed such a keen interest that he later prescribed remedies to his soldiers on campaign. He was not content to command from a distance. He wished to understand the very workings of the human body and how it could endure suffering. This attention to detail, planted by Aristotle, would remain with him all his life. Philosophy was the heart of their lessons. Aristotle introduced Alexander to ethics, logic, and metaphysics. Questions about what it means to live well, what it means to know truth, what it means to rule justly. These ideas were not abstract to a boy destined to wear a crown. They were practical. How should a king behave? Should he be a servant of law or above it? Should he seek the happiness of his people or his own glory? These debates were not easy, and Alexander was not the sort of student to accept his master's word without challenge. He argued fiercely, sometimes stubbornly, pressing his own views with a confidence unusual for his age. He listened, but he also tested. This sharpness of mind impressed Aristotle, but also caused friction. For even at this young age, Alexander's spirit was already straining against authority. Literature and poetry held a special place in Alexander's education. Above all, he was captivated by Homer's Iliad. Aristotle prepared a special edition for him, with careful notes, and it became Alexander's treasured possession. He studied Achilles not only as a character, but as a model of life. Achilles was courageous, swift, driven by a desire for eternal glory, even at the cost of his own life. Alexander longed to walk in his footsteps. He believed himself linked to Achilles by blood through his mother Olympias, and he nurtured this connection until it became a central part of his identity. To him, the world was a stage upon which he, like Achilles, must perform great deeds, ensuring his name would echo through time. The Iliad was not merely a book, it was a manual for immortality. Yet if Homer inspired him, Aristotle tempered him with the lessons of tragedy and history. Plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides taught him about fate, pride, and the cost of hubris, bris, meaning excessive pride. Histories of Herodotus and Thucydides taught him about the rise and fall of states, the importance of strategy, and the harsh realities of power. From these works, Alexander absorbed the idea that greatness came not only from victory, but from understanding the fragility of human affairs. He began to see that kingship was as much about wisdom as it was about bravery. Still, Aristotle instilled in him prejudices that would mark his worldview. He taught that Greeks were naturally superior to barbarians, and that the role of Greece was to lead, not to follow. Alexander absorbed this, but with time he would challenge it, blending it with a broader vision of unity between peoples. The seeds of this tension, between exclusion and inclusion, between domination and integration, were planted in these years. He was taught to believe in the special destiny of Greece, but he also possessed a mind restless enough to question the boundaries of culture and identity. Later, this would lead him to embrace Persian dress, customs, and officials, to the outrage of his Macedonian companions. But as a youth, he was still shaped by Aristotle's distinctions. Beyond books, Alexander's education included the arts of speech and persuasion. He trained in rhetoric, learning how to command an audience with words as well as with arms. He practiced debates, delivered speeches, and honed the rhythm of language. He would later use this skill to inspire soldiers before battle, moving them with visions of glory and destiny. He learned to bend language as he bent men, always with an instinct for drama. For Alexander knew instinctively that conquest was not only about steel, it was about belief. A king must persuade as well as command. Even amidst these intellectual pursuits, Alexander never neglected the physical training expected of a prince. His days at Mieza combined lessons in philosophy with drills in hunting, riding, archery, and combat. He trained to endure hunger, thirst, and cold, to run long distances, to ride for hours without rest. The fusion of mind and body created a young man who was not merely clever but unbreakable, able to carry his knowledge into the harshest conditions. It was this balance, the philosopher-warrior that set Alexander apart from many rulers before him. The bonds formed at Mieza were equally important. His companions became more than fellow students. They became the brotherhood that would later ride with him across the known world. Among them, Hephaestion held a special place. Their closeness was legendary, likened to that of Achilles and Patroclus in Homer's epic. Their bond was one of deep trust, affection, and loyalty, a partnership that would endure through every campaign. To Alexander, friendship was not separate from power, it was part of it. His companions were his counsel, his support, and at times, his rivals. The education they shared bound them together, but it also sowed the seeds of later conflict, as ambition and jealousy eventually split them apart. Aristotle, despite his brilliance, did not entirely approve of his pupil's restless spirit. He saw in Alexander a dangerous blend of eagerness and pride, and he worried that philosophy might become for him not a guide, but a tool. Aristotle's ideal was a balanced life, guided by moderation. Alexander was not moderate. He burned with a desire to surpass limits, to test boundaries, to seize the extraordinary. He studied moderation, but he did not live it. He respected his teacher, but he did not wish to become him. In later years, Alexander would criticize Aristotle for some of his teachings, especially his disdain for non-Greeks. By then, Alexander had begun to see himself not only as a Greek leader, but as a ruler of the world. The lessons of Mieza shaped him, but they could not contain him. As he grew older, Alexander's education shifted from study to practice. He joined his father on campaign, witnessing sieges, negotiations, and the maneuvers of armies. He saw how Philip used cunning as well as force, bribing some opponents, intimidating others, and crushing those who stood firm. He saw the delicate balance of alliances, the role of marriage in diplomacy, and the use of religion to sanctify power. These experiences taught him that knowledge was useless without application, and that philosophy had to be lived in action. He was no longer only a student, he was an apprentice king. In time, his education would end formally, but it never truly left him. On campaign, he carried Aristotle's annotated Iliad with him, treasuring it alongside his weapons. He sought counsel from philosophers he encountered, even as he pressed into foreign lands. He healed soldiers with remedies he had studied, and he debated questions of governance with his companions. His mind was always alive, always restless, always searching. The boy at Mieza became the man who would found cities, spread Greek culture, and blend it with others, creating what we now call the Hellenistic world. The education that began in Macedonia would echo from Egypt to India. By the time he left Mieza, Alexander was no longer a boy chasing shadows. He was a prince with a vision of greatness, armed not only with the sword, but with the word and the idea. He had tasted philosophy, and though he did not live by moderation, he understood its power. He had read the epics, and he believed himself their heir. He had studied history, and he resolved to surpass it. Knowledge had not softened him, it had sharpened him. He was ready to step from the schoolroom to the battlefield, from the teachings of Aristotle to the lessons of life. And in that step, the education of Alexander was not an ending, but a beginning, preparing him to carve his path through the world. When Alexander emerged from his years of study under Aristotle, he stepped into a world already vibrating with the ambitions of his father. Philip II had not only secured Macedonia's survival, but transformed it into the dominant power of Greece. Through a combination of sharp military reforms, calculated diplomacy, and sheer determination, he had bent city-states to his will and prepared the ground for something greater. A march east against the Persian Empire. For the young Alexander, barely in his mid-teens, this was both an apprenticeship and a testing ground. His education had filled his mind with heroes and philosophy, but now he had to prove himself not with words, but with deeds. The years of his youth as prince were marked by war, intrigue, and the constant shadow of his father, whose genius he admired, but whose dominance he resented. At 16, Philip entrusted him with authority for the first time. Macedonia could not be governed from the saddle alone, and when Philip campaigned against Byzantium, he left Alexander behind as regent. For a boy barely past childhood, this was both a privilege and a trial. Almost immediately, rebellion tested him. The Thracian Mede tribe rose in revolt, assuming the absence of the king was an invitation to seize advantage. Alexander's response was swift and ruthless. He raised an army, marched against the rebels, crushed them, and founded a new settlement on their captured ground. He named it Alexandropolis, planting his name as if to declare to the world that he was no mere child of the court, but a leader in his own right. The lesson was clear. Authority was not inherited simply by blood, it had to be seized and demonstrated. In this, Alexander passed his first trial as regent. Soon after, he was given an even greater test. In 338 BCE, Philip prepared to face the combined forces of Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea, a decisive clash for control of Greece. The Athenian statesman Demosthenes had stirred opposition to Philip, rallying alliances in a last desperate attempt to resist Macedonian power. For Alexander, this battle was his chance to step onto the grand stage of Greek politics. He commanded the left wing of the Macedonian army, while his father led the center. It was not a ceremonial role. He faced the famed Theban sacred band, an elite corps of soldiers bound by bonds of loyalty and love, who had never been broken in battle. The clash was fierce, and the outcome uncertain until Alexander, leading a cavalry charge with reckless bravery, smashed through the enemy lines. The Theban sacred band was annihilated, the alliance shattered, and Macedonia stood supreme over Greece. The victory was Philip's, but the glory of the charge belonged to his son. At just 18 years old, Alexander had carved his name into history. The city-states could no longer dismiss him as a boy. He was the heir to a kingdom that had become master of Greece. Yet, if the battlefield confirmed his promise, that the palace revealed his vulnerabilities. The court at Pella was a place of intrigue, faction, and shifting loyalties. Philip's successes had created both admiration and resentment, and his marital politics only added fuel. Olympias, Alexander's mother, was proud, ambitious, and fiercely protective of her son. But Philip's attentions wandered, and his alliances demanded new unions. When he married Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian noblewoman of pure lineage, the court buzzed with rumors. This marriage threatened to displace Alexander as heir. Olympias, a foreigner from Epirus, could see her position weakening. The tension exploded at a wedding banquet when one of Cleopatra's relatives toasted the hope that she might give Philippa legitimate, heir meaning one without foreign blood. Alexander, enraged, shouted back an insult, and Philip, drunk, attempted to lunge at him. The king stumbled and fell, humiliated, while Alexander stormed out, declaring that a man who could not even walk across a hall without collapsing was unfit to lead armies across Persia. For a time, Alexander left Macedonia with his mother, retreating into exile in Epirus. It seemed that the bond between father and son, already strained by pride and rivalry, had been broken. This rupture, however, was temporary. Political necessity forced reconciliation. Philip's plans for Persia required stability at home, and Alexander's talents could not be ignored. Father and son came together once more, though the bitterness lingered. Alexander returned to court, outwardly loyal, yet always conscious of the precariousness of his position. He had admirers among the army, men who had fought with him at Chaeronea and seen his courage firsthand. But he also had enemies, courtiers who whispered against him. Fearful of his temper, his pride, and his closeness to Olympias, the palace of Pella was no less dangerous than the battlefield. As these rivalries simmered, Philip's power reached its peak. He secured control over Greece through the League of Corinth, a federation of states that acknowledged him as hegemon or leader. With Greece subdued, he turned his gaze eastward. Persia, the ancient enemy, was vulnerable. Its empire was vast, stretching from Asia Minor to Babylon, from Egypt to India. But it was weakened by internal conflict and complacent rulers. Philip prepared to cross into Asia with an army unlike any Greece had ever seen. For Alexander, the prospect was intoxicating. Here was the chance to become Achilles reborn, to conquer lands sung of in Homer's epics, to etch his name beside the greatest heroes. But destiny was not yet ready to call him east. Instead, fate intervened in the most sudden and violent way. In 336 BCE, as Philip celebrated the marriage of his daughter Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus, Olympia's brother, tragedy struck. During the festival at Aigi, Philip entered the theatre in triumph, surrounded by nobles and guards. Suddenly, one of his own bodyguards, Pausanias, rushed forward and stabbed him to death. The scene descended into chaos. Some claimed Pausanias acted out of personal grievance, others that he was manipulated by deeper conspiracies. Whispers spread that Olympias had a hand in it, eager to see her son elevated, or that Persian agents plotted from afar. The truth remains uncertain, but the result was beyond doubt. Philip was dead, struck down at the very moment of his greatest glory. The murder created a dangerous vacuum. Philip had held Macedonia together through charisma and force. Without him, enemies at home and abroad scented opportunity. Alexander, at just 20, had to move with lightning speed. The moment he heard the news, he seized the throne, backed by the loyalty of the army. But kingship in Macedonia was not guaranteed by birth alone. It had to be secured by force and fear. Alexander acted decisively. He had rivals executed, including potential claimants and even Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant child, whose existence could have undermined his claim. The court was purged, and his mother Olympias encouraged his ruthlessness. To some, it seemed a bloody betrayal, but to Alexander it was survival. In the brutal politics of the age, hesitation meant death. He had learned from Philip not only the art of battle, but the art of power. With his throne secure, Alexander turned outward. Greece stirred restlessly, thinking Philip's death might free them. Thebes rose in revolt, encouraged by hopes of Persian support. Athens hesitated, weighing its options. Alexander marched south with speed that stunned his enemies. Within weeks he appeared at the gates of Thebes, demanding surrender. When the city resisted, he stormed it with overwhelming force. Thebes was razed, its walls torn down, its people slaughtered or sold into slavery. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared, a symbolic gesture of respect for Greek culture. The destruction of Thebes sent a message louder than any proclamation. Alexander would not be challenged. Athens, seeing the ruin of its ally, submitted. The League of Corinth renewed its loyalty, and Alexander stood as master of Greece, just as his father had before him. These years as prince and young king hardened Alexander. They taught him that victory was not only won in pitched battles, but in the delicate balance of loyalty, fear, and power. He had learned that glory could not shield him from the daggers of politics, that even a father could become a rival, and that survival demanded ruthlessness. Yet they also confirmed his sense of destiny. At Chaeronea, he had proved his courage against Greece's finest. As regent, he had shown he could govern. As heir, he had navigated betrayal, exile, and reconciliation. And as king, he had destroyed Thebes to secure his throne. Each trial shaped him, stripping away uncertainty and replacing it with an iron confidence. He was no longer the boy of Aristotle's classroom, nor the hot-tempered son rebuked by his father. He was Alexander, king of Macedonia, heir to Philip's vision, and ready to claim for himself the empire that stretched across the horizon. Yet beneath the surface, the scars of these years remained. He had seen his father humiliated by drink and murdered by his own guard. He had felt the sting of insult and the taste of exile. He had blood on his hands, not only of enemies but of rivals who shared his blood. He had learned to wear the mask of command, but behind it burned the restless fire of one who believed himself destined for greatness. These contradictions, the philosopher and the warrior, the ruthless ruler and the idealist heir of Achilles, would define him in the years to come. The Prince of Macedonia had become king, but he was already looking beyond his kingdom. The world lay waiting, and Alexander was ready to seize it. The murder of Philip II sent shockwaves through Macedonia and across Greece. A kingdom that had risen to power on the back of one man's genius could have collapsed in the moment his blood darkened the stones of Aegae. For Philip had been more than a king. He was the architect of Macedonian supremacy, the commander who had bent Greece to his will, and the visionary who had prepared the invasion of Persia. His sudden death left a void so deep that enemies within, and without sharpened their knives, believing Macedonia would crumble. At the center of the storm stood Alexander, a youth of just 20 years, whose claim to the throne was both natural and contested. He was Philip's son, yes, but not his only child, and the resentments of the court, the ambitions of rivals, and the instability of newly conquered Greece meant that his position was far from secure. What followed was a ruthless display of resolve and clarity, as Alexander proved in those first months that he would not be a boy, king but a ruler whose will could shape nations. When the news spread that Philip had been struck down, confusion erupted. Some rushed to secure their positions, others to escape vengeance, while still others whispered of plots. The assassin, Pausanias, was himself cut down immediately, leaving behind only speculation about his motives. Was it personal revenge, as some said, for grievances against Philip? Or was it part of a deeper conspiracy, perhaps involving Olympias, who had always burned with ambition for her son, or even Persian agents who feared Philip's coming war? The truth would never be known, and Alexander, whatever he suspected, understood that answers mattered less than action. Hesitation would destroy him. He had to seize control before rivals gathered strength. The army was the key. In Macedonia, the loyalty of the soldiers was the foundation of the crown. Alexander had fought beside them, led charges, and shared their hardships. They knew him as more than a princeling. They knew him as a commander who bled with them. He called the troops together, stood before them not as a grieving son, but as a leader, and demanded their recognition. His presence, his reputation from Chaeronea, and the memory of Philip's trust won them over. The army hailed him as king. With the military behind him, his claim gained the weight of steel. Still, loyalty was not universal. Rebels lurked in the shadows of the court. Men who dreamed of placing another of Philip's children on the throne, or who despised Olympias' foreign blood. Alexander acted without mercy. He ordered the execution of potential claimants, including Amyntas, the son of Philip's elder brother, whose lineage might have made him a focus for discontent. He eliminated threats swiftly, knowing that half measures were fatal in such times. His mother, never shy of cruelty, pursued her own vengeance. Cleopatra Eurydice, Philip's last wife, and her infant daughter were killed, ensuring no Macedonian-born rival could emerge to challenge Alexander. These acts, grim and pitiless, stained the beginning of his reign, but they were necessary to secure it. A king who wavered in the face of rivals would not survive a month. Once the court was secured, Alexander turned to the wider kingdom. Thracian tribes to the north tested him with rebellion, assuming his youth made him weak. He marched against them with the speed of lightning, leading his forces across the Haemus mountains. When the tribes rolled wagons downhill to crush the Macedonian advance, Alexander calmly ordered his men to open their ranks, let the wagons thunder through, and then close again. The enemy, astonished, was routed. This victory sent a message to all watching. Alexander was not a boy to be trifled with. He would inherit not only his father's crown, but his mastery of war. Yet the true test lay further south. Greece was restless. Athens, Thebes, and other city-states believed Philip's death freed them from Macedonian dominance. Rumors spread of Persian gold being used to fund rebellion. Thebes, proud and defiant, rose in open revolt, slaughtering a Macedonian garrison and calling for others to join them. Alexander responded with the ferocity of a storm. He marched his army south in a display of breathtaking speed, covering hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, appearing before the walls of Thebes, before many Greeks even realized he had left Macedonia. The suddenness of his arrival struck terror into the cities. Athens hesitated, debating in its assembly while Thebes prepared to fight. Alexander offered them a chance to submit, but their refusal sealed their fate. The assault on Thebes was brutal. The Macedonian army stormed the walls, and once inside, the slaughter began. Men were cut down in the streets, women and children dragged away in chains. Thebes, once a proud city that had humbled Sparta and challenged Athens, was reduced to rubble. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar was spared, a symbolic gesture to honor Greek culture. The destruction was total, and its meaning unmistakable. Alexander had given Greece a lesson in the price of defiance. He would later regret the harshness of the act, for it cast a shadow over his reputation among the Greeks, but at the time it was cold calculation. By annihilating one city, he ensured the submission of all others. Athens bowed its head, its orators silenced by fear. The League of Corinth renewed its loyalty, confirming Alexander as hegemon, leader of the united Greeks. In one stroke, he had secured his southern flank, leaving him free to pursue his father's dream of invading Persia. Still, Alexander was not content with mere fear. He understood the importance of image and persuasion. He presented himself not only as king of Macedonia, but as champion of the Greeks, the avenger of past wrongs committed by Persia. He reminded them of the burning of Athens during the Persian Wars, of the battles of Marathon and Salamis, when Greece had fought for its survival. He declared that the coming campaign would not be conquest for its own sake, but justice, a holy war to punish the Persians and liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor. It was propaganda, but it worked. Even Athens, humbled though it was, lent its ships to the cause. Alexander had transformed the fragile unity of Greece into a weapon directed outward, not inward. As he prepared for the expedition, he made arrangements at home. He appointed Antipater, one of his father's most trusted generals, as regent of Macedonia in his absence. This choice was wise, for Antipater was both loyal and experienced, capable of maintaining order, while Alexander pursued glory abroad. He secured the loyalty of his nobles with honours and promises, binding them to his cause. He organized supplies, levies of soldiers, and the coordination of fleets. Every detail was considered, for the crossing into Asia was no small venture. The Persian Empire was vast and wealthy, and though weakened, it could still summon immense armies. Alexander knew he was not simply continuing his father's dream. He was embarking on a gamble that could either crown him with immortality or destroy him utterly. Before his departure, he made a symbolic journey to Delphi, the sacred site of Apollo's oracle. The priests there, though hesitant to deliver prophecies on command, declared him invincible. The words may have been forced, for Alexander was not above intimidation, but they fed his growing sense of destiny. He also made offerings at Troy, honouring Achilles at his supposed burial mound. In these acts, he bound himself to the lineage of heroes, presenting his campaign as not merely political or military, but sacred. He was Achilles reborn, avenger of Greece, chosen of the gods. His men, stirred by this vision, followed him not as soldiers alone, but as participants in a great and eternal story. By the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander was ready. He gathered his army, numbering perhaps 35,000 men, a blend of Macedonian phalanx, Greek allies, and cavalry that formed the hammer of his force. It was smaller than the armies Persia could field, but it was hardened, disciplined, and led with brilliance. He crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separated Europe from Asia, and as he set foot upon the shore, he cast a spear into the soil and declared it land won by the spear of Macedonia. With that symbolic gesture, the invasion began. Behind him lay a secure Macedonia and a subdued Greece. Before him lay the greatest empire the world had ever known. The boy who had once tamed Bucephalus, who had studied under Aristotle, who had led charges at Chaeronea and crushed Thebes, was now stepping into the vast arena of history. His throne had been seized not through inheritance alone, but through ruthless will, decisive action, and the terror of his enemies. Now he would test whether the same qualities could carry him across continents. In the span of less than 2 years, Alexander had transformed himself from a precarious heir to an unchallenged ruler. He had eliminated rivals, subdued tribes, crushed rebellion, and united Greece under his command. He had turned his father's assassination, a moment that could have shattered the kingdom, into an opportunity to prove his strength. He had shown that kingship was not a gift of birth, but a prize seized by blood and resolve. Yet for all he had achieved, these were but the opening moves of his life. The throne was his, Greece was his, but the world beyond still waited. Persia stretched eastward like a vast promise, its wealth and splendour beckoning. Alexander's youth had been spent preparing, his early reign had been spent securing. Now the stage was set for conquest. The throne had been seized. The empire was about to be won. The spring of 334 BCE marked the moment when Alexander's ambition finally crossed from promise to reality. With his position in Macedonia secure and Greece cowed into obedience, he turned his gaze eastward toward the Persian Empire. The plan had been his father's, but the execution would be his. Philip had envisioned a campaign of vengeance, a renewal of the ancient struggle between Greece and Persia, but Alexander would transform it into something far greater, something that would carry him to the edge of the known world. For now, though, the challenge was immense. He led an army of some 5,000 men across the Hellespont, a force that seemed small compared to the vast resources Persia could command. Yet Alexander carried with him not just soldiers, but momentum, discipline, and a vision of destiny. The spear he cast into the soil of Asia as he leapt from his ship was more than a gesture. It was a declaration that he intended to take the continent by force. His army was a blend of Macedonian and Greek strength. At its heart was the phalanx, armed with the long sarissa, a spear that could reach enemy lines before they could strike back. This formation, drilled to perfection by Philip and now entrusted to Alexander, was nearly unbreakable in close combat. Alongside the phalanx rode the companion cavalry, elite horsemen who followed Alexander himself into battle, a hammer to the phalanx's anvil. Supporting them were archers, slingers, and allied Greek contingents, each adding depth to the army. Though smaller than Persian hosts, this army had been forged through discipline and innovation, and its spirit was fired by Alexander's charisma. He rode Bucephalus at the front, fearless, sharing danger with his men, and it was this shared risk that bound them to him, with a loyalty that would endure through years of hardship. Before his first clash with Persia, Alexander performed an act of symbolism. He visited the ruins of Troy, the legendary site of Homer's epic, and offered sacrifices at the supposed tomb of Achilles. He laid a wreath there, as though binding himself to the memory of the hero he had always revered. Hephaestion, his closest companion, honored Patroclus, Achilles' beloved friend. In this way, Alexander linked his campaign not to mere conquest, but to myth, presenting himself as a figure in continuity with Homer's world. His men, steeped in the same stories, could not help but feel they were part of something greater than themselves. To fight under Alexander was to fight for a place in history. The Persians, for their part, did not underestimate the threat. Darius III, king of Persia, was aware of the invasion and dispatched satraps, regional governors, to confront Alexander at the very beginning of his campaign. They gathered their forces near the river Granicus in Asia Minor, confident that they could crush the Macedonian force before it gained a foothold. Their numbers were far greater, composed of Persian cavalry and Greek mercenaries hired with Persian gold. To many observers, the outcome seemed inevitable. Alexander's smaller army would be swept aside, and the invasion ended before it began. But Alexander, as always, chose audacity. The Battle of the Granicus was his first great test against Persia. The river, swollen with spring rains, separated the two armies. The Persian cavalry lined the opposite bank, waiting to cut down any who attempted to cross. Conventional wisdom suggested that Alexander should wait, camp, and seek a better place to ford. His generals urged caution, warning that an assault across the river would be madness. Alexander ignored them. He understood the psychological power of a first strike. If he hesitated, the aura of invincibility that surrounded him might weaken. If he attacked, and won, it would set the tone for the entire campaign. He led the charge himself, plunging into the river with his cavalry, water surging around their horses' legs as arrows whistled overhead. The fighting was savage at the banks, with Alexander hacking through Persian nobles, his spear shattering, his sword flashing. At one point he was nearly killed, struck on the head by an axe, only saved when a comrade cut down his attacker. Blood poured from his helmet, but he fought on, rallying his men. Slowly the Macedonians gained the upper bank. The phalanx pressed forward, and the Persians broke, The Greek mercenaries, left isolated, were cut down mercilessly. Thousands lay dead, and Alexander had his first great victory in Asia. The message was unmistakable. He had come not as an invader to be repelled, but as a conqueror destined to triumph. After Granicus, the Greek cities of Asia Minor opened their gates to him. Some welcomed him as a liberator, tired of Persian control. Others resisted, and he treated them harshly, reminding all that submission brought mercy but defiance brought ruin. He re-established democratic governments in some cities, presenting himself as the champion of Greek freedom, though always under his supervision. He was careful to frame his war as one of justice, avenging the past Persian invasions of Greece, but also of liberation, freeing Greeks from foreign domination. This double message, vengeance and freedom, made him popular among many, though it was also a mask for his own ambition. As he moved south along the coast, he encountered fortified resistance at Halicarnassus, ruled by the Persian satrap Memnon of Rhodes. Memnon was no ordinary opponent. He was a skilled commander and strategist who understood the danger Alexander posed. The siege of Halicarnassus dragged on, testing Alexander's patience. The city's high walls and strong defenses repelled assault after assault. At night, fires blazed as sorties harried the Macedonians. Yet Alexander persisted, pressing the attack, refusing to withdraw. Eventually, the defenders burned much of the city themselves before retreating. The fall of Halicarnassus secured Alexander's control of the western coast of Asia Minor. It also showed him that not every conquest would come easily. Cities could resist fiercely, and Persian commanders like Memnon could be dangerous foes. In the aftermath, Alexander reorganized the lands he had taken. He did not impose purely Macedonian rule, but worked through a blend of local customs and his own authority. He allowed many cities to retain elements of self-government, but he ensured loyalty by placing Macedonian garrisons and trusted officials in key positions. He understood that to conquer Persia, he would need more than force. He would need to manage diverse peoples, blending their traditions with his rule. Already, the seeds of his later policies of integration were present. During this time, he also showed the traits that made him a leader beloved by his men. He shared their hardships, marching on foot when they did, eating the same rations, enduring the same heat and cold. He was generous with rewards and honors, recognizing bravery in battle, raising common soldiers to prominence if they distinguished themselves. This created a sense of shared purpose, a loyalty that was deeper than fear. His men did not see him as a distant monarch, but as a commander who bled with them. Such loyalty would carry him across deserts, mountains, and rivers in the years to come. Yet Alexander was not blind to the dangers still ahead. He knew Darius himself would not remain passive forever. The Persian king was gathering forces, preparing a massive response to the Macedonian incursion. Granicus had been only the beginning, a skirmish compared to what was to come. Alexander's victories gave him momentum, but he was deep in enemy territory, with supply lines stretched and hostile armies forming. He needed to secure the loyalty of the Greek cities firmly, consolidate his control of Asia Minor, and prepare for the inevitable clash with the full might of Persia. As he pushed further inland, he also revealed the intensity of his own character. In one episode, he visited the city of Gordium, where a famous knot was tied around an ancient wagon in the temple of Zeus. The legend said that whoever could untie the Gordian knot would rule all of Asia. Alexander, confronted with the intricate mass of ropes, tried for a time to loosen it. When the knot resisted, he simply drew his sword and sliced through it. Whether this was an act of impatience or genius, it became a symbol of his approach to problems. When faced with complexity, he cut straight to the solution by force of will. The story spread, reinforcing his image as a man destined to rule. By the end of his first year in Asia Minor, Alexander had achieved what many thought impossible. He had crossed the Hellespont, defeated a Persian army at Granicus, captured key cities, and secured the loyalty of much of the coast. His authority was now recognized across Western Asia Minor, and his men, though wary, were inspired by his successes. Persia, however, was only beginning to respond. Darius, shaken by the loss but still ruler of a vast empire, gathered his forces for a confrontation that would dwarf the battles so far. The stage was set for Issus, where Alexander would face not satraps and mercenaries, but the great king himself. In these early campaigns, Alexander revealed the qualities that defined him: audacity, speed, and the ability to inspire. He attacked when others advised caution, seized opportunities with boldness, and never allowed hesitation to sap his momentum. He fused the imagery of myth with the realities of strategy, presenting himself as both Achilles reborn and a commander of unmatched skill. He treated his men with familiarity yet commanded their obedience, creating a bond of loyalty rare in ancient armies. Above all, he proved that he was not merely continuing his father's vision, but surpassing it. Philip had dreamed of striking Persia. Alexander had already done so, and with spectacular success. The invasion of Asia Minor was only the beginning, but it set the tone for everything that followed. Each victory deepened his conviction that he was chosen by destiny. Each conquest expanded his ambition beyond what even Philip had imagined. The spear he thrust into the soil of Asia at the Hellespont had been a symbol, but now it was becoming reality. Alexander was no longer the young king proving himself against rivals at home. He was a conqueror, the master of Western Asia Minor, and his path stretched inexorably toward the heart of Persia. By the autumn of 333 BCE, Alexander had already carved his way through Western Asia Minor, toppling satraps, seizing cities, and demonstrating that his army, though small by comparison, was a force of extraordinary power. Yet he knew that what he had faced so far was only the beginning. The Persian Empire was vast, stretching across continents, and its true strength had not yet been tested against him. Darius, the great king himself, had until now relied on regional governors and mercenaries to contain the Macedonian invasion. Their failure at the Granicus had shaken Persian confidence, but had not broken it. Now, at last, Darius resolved to take the field in person. For Alexander, this was the challenge he had been waiting for. Not satraps with scattered forces, but the King of Kings, ruler of Persia, arrayed with the full majesty of the empire. The clash would take place at Issus, and it would transform both men's destinies. Alexander had advanced steadily along the coast of Asia Minor, securing supply lines and ensuring that the Greek cities were bound to him. He had pressed southward toward Cilicia, crossing the narrow mountain passes that opened the way into Syria. His army was not vast, numbering perhaps 40,000 at most, yet it was seasoned, loyal, and drilled to perfection. He himself was at the center of it all, not merely as commander, but as a constant presence on the march, riding among his men, enduring their hardships, sharing their rations. The summer had been brutal, and at one point he fell ill with fever, a sickness so severe that some thought he would die. His physicians hesitated to treat him, fearing the blame if their remedies failed, until one doctor, Philip of Acarnania, offered him a potion. As Alexander raised the cup to his lips, a letter arrived warning him that the physician had been bribed by Darius to poison him. Without hesitation, Alexander drank the draught while handing the letter to his doctor, locking eyes with him as he swallowed. It was a calculated gesture of trust, a performance of courage, and when he recovered, the army's devotion to him only deepened. To them, their king was fearless, a man who could not be undone by treachery or sickness. Meanwhile, Darius gathered his forces. The Persian king commanded immense resources, and he called upon levies from across his empire, cavalry from the plains, infantry from the east, Greek mercenaries funded by Persian gold, and contingents from distant provinces. His numbers dwarfed Alexander's, perhaps by 2 or 3 to 1, but size was not the same as unity. The Persian army was a mosaic of peoples, speaking different languages, bound together only by the command of their king. Darius himself was not an incompetent ruler, but he was no Philip, no hardened general. His reign had begun with instability, and now his authority depended on proving he could repel the Macedonian invader. To retreat or delay would be to admit weakness. He marched northward, determined to cut Alexander off from Greece by moving behind him. The two armies converged near the narrow plain of Issus, hemmed in by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. The stage was set not for a wide, open battle but for a compressed clash where Persian numbers could not be fully deployed. When Alexander realized that Darius had moved into his rear, he wheeled his army around with the speed that had already become his hallmark. He marched back through the passes, covering ground in a blur of urgency, bringing his men face to face with the Persians across the Penaris River. The sight was daunting. The Persian host stretched across the plain, banners flying, chariots gleaming, cavalry massed in dense formations. At its center stood Darius himself, elevated in a magnificent chariot, surrounded by his guard. The great king's presence was intended to inspire his men and intimidate his enemies, for never before had Alexander faced an opponent so visibly the embodiment of empire. Yet far from being daunted, the Macedonians were eager. For them, the presence of Darius meant not just another battle, but the possibility of ending the war in a single stroke. The fight began with Alexander taking his usual position on the right wing, leading the companion cavalry. The phalanx advanced across the river in the center, their long spears bristling like a forest of steel. The Persians rained arrows down, and their Greek mercenaries pressed hard against the Macedonians. But the discipline of the phalanx held. Alexander, meanwhile, led a thunderous charge into the Persian left. He aimed not at the periphery, but directly at the gap that would allow him to swing against Darius himself. The fighting was vicious, with cavalry colliding, blades flashing, and men hurled from their saddles into the river. Alexander himself fought at the front, his armor glinting, his eyes fixed on the chariot where Darius stood. Slowly, inexorably, the Persian left began to buckle under the weight of the charge. In the center, the battle raged fiercely. The Persian infantry and mercenaries resisted, driving the Macedonian phalanx back into the river, threatening to break their line. For a moment, the outcome hung in the balance. But Alexander's attack on the flank forced a turning point. As he smashed through the Persian cavalry, he wheeled inward, threatening the position of the great king. Darius, seeing the danger, lost his nerve. Accounts differ on the exact moment, but all agree that the sight of Alexander bearing down on him caused panic. The great king abandoned his chariot and fled on horseback, leaving behind his royal banner, his bow, and his family. The Persian army, seeing their king depart, collapsed into rout. Panic spread like fire, and what had been a contest of arms became a slaughter. The Macedonians pursued the fleeing troops, cutting them down, while Alexander claimed the field. The victory at Issus was staggering. Against overwhelming numbers, Alexander had not only triumphed, but sent the Persian king himself fleeing in disgrace. The casualties on the Persian side numbered in the tens of thousands, while Macedonian losses were relatively light. More than that, Alexander now held something even more valuable than weapons or gold: the royal family of Persia. Darius' mother, wife and daughters had been left behind in the royal camp, and they fell into Alexander's hands. Here, his conduct displayed both his sense of theatre and his surprising restraint. He treated the captured women with respect, allowing them to retain their dignity and status. He forbade any insult or violation, insisting they be honoured as befitted royalty. For the Persians, this was astonishing. For Alexander's men, it enhanced his image as not merely a conqueror, but a ruler of nobility. The propaganda value was immense, reinforcing the idea that he was destined to replace Darius, not merely defeat him. Darius, humiliated, attempted to salvage the situation with diplomacy. He sent envoys offering Alexander immense ransom for his family and even peace terms that would grant him vast territories west of the Euphrates. To many, this seemed a generous offer, a chance to secure wealth and recognition without further risk. Alexander, however, dismissed it with contempt. He declared that since Darius had fled the field, he was no true king, and that he, Alexander, was now master of Asia. He would not accept a share of the Persian Empire when he could claim it entire. His ambition was no longer about avenging Greece or securing the coast. It had grown into something boundless: the conquest of the world. After Issus, Alexander pressed southward into Syria and then toward Egypt, systematically dismantling Persian control. Cities submitted, fearing his wrath, though some, like Tyre, would resist fiercely. His reputation soared, not just among his soldiers but across the lands he entered. To many he seemed unstoppable, a figure touched by the gods. His enemies fled before him, his allies swelled in number, and his vision expanded with each step. The Persian king, still on his throne, would rally again, but his authority had been broken. The aura of invincibility had shifted from Persia to Macedonia. The Battle of Issus was not merely a military victory, but a turning point in history. It shattered the illusion of Persian supremacy, revealed the vulnerability of the empire, and elevated Alexander from a bold young king to a conqueror of legend. He had stared down the great king, forced him to flee, and claimed his family as hostages. In the minds of his men and of the world, the balance had shifted irreversibly. Persia was no longer the master, Alexander was. The campaign that followed would carry him further, to sieges, to deserts, and eventually to the heart of Persia itself. But Issus was the moment where the Persian campaign truly began. It was here that Alexander announced to the world that he was not merely Philip's son continuing a war of vengeance, but a leader of destiny, a man who would not stop until the empire of Darius lay at his feet. From the banks of the Panaris River, the course of history bent toward him, and nothing would ever be the same again. After the victory at Issus, Alexander stood at a crossroads that was both strategic and symbolic. Darius had fled eastward to gather another army, leaving the heart of Persia intact but shaken. Alexander might have chosen to pursue him directly into Mesopotamia and strike for the empire's core. Yet he knew that to advance without securing his rear would be folly. The Persian fleet still dominated the eastern Mediterranean, supplied by rich coastal cities loyal to Darius, and if left unchecked, it could strike at Greece or cut off Alexander's supply lines. To secure his conquest, he needed control of the sea, and to control the sea, he needed the ports. Thus, rather than chase Darius into the heartland, Alexander turned southward, marching through Syria and down the Levantine coast, determined to break Persian naval power city by city. Some cities submitted without resistance, awed by his victory at Issus. Others resisted, trusting in their fortifications and fleets. Among these, none was more formidable than Tyre, a great Phoenician city built partly on the mainland, but chiefly on an island half a mile from the shore. Its walls rose sheer from the sea, towering 30 meters high, making it nearly impregnable. When Alexander demanded its surrender, the Tyrians refused, confident that no army could bridge the waters to reach them. To most commanders, this would have been a signal to bypass the city, but Alexander's ambition and stubborn pride left no room for defiance. If Tyre resisted, other cities might be emboldened. He resolved to take it, no matter the cost. The siege of Tyre became one of the most remarkable episodes of his career. Deprived of ships strong enough to storm the city directly, Alexander ordered his men to build a causeway, a massive stone and timber mole stretching from the shore to the island. Day by day, they advanced into the sea, piling earth and rubble, while Tyrian ships and defenders rained missiles upon them. Progress was slow and costly. The Tyrians launched fire ships to burn the siege towers, diving into the water to sabotage the works, fighting with ferocity to preserve their independence. Yet Alexander refused to be deterred. He summoned ships from allied ports, assembling a fleet strong enough to challenge Tyre at sea. With land and water pressed together, the city's fate grew grim. After 7 months, the causeway reached the walls, and a coordinated assault began. Battering rams and towers struck from the mole, while ships attacked the walls from the sea. At last, the Macedonians broke through. The slaughter that followed was merciless. Thousands were killed, and thousands more sold into slavery. Tyre, the jewel of Phoenicia, had defied Alexander and paid the price. The scale of destruction was meant to send a message to all who might resist him. Defiance would bring annihilation. The fall of Tyre was a turning point in Alexander's coastal campaign. With its fleet captured or destroyed, Persian naval power in the eastern Mediterranean was broken. Other cities submitted swiftly. Gaza, another fortified city, resisted stubbornly but fell after a brutal siege. its defenders killed, and its people enslaved. Alexander himself was wounded during the assault, struck in the shoulder by a catapult bolt, yet he pressed on, sharing the dangers of his men. By the time he marched into Egypt in 332 BCE, resistance had all but evaporated. The Egyptians, long resentful of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. To them, the Persians had been foreign oppressors who desecrated temples and imposed harsh rule. Alexander, with his policy of respecting local customs and gods, appeared as a savior. His entry into Egypt was triumphant. At Memphis, he was hailed as pharaoh, the traditional title of Egyptian kings, and he offered sacrifices to the native gods. He visited the temple of Ptah, honoring the ancient traditions, and sought to present himself not as conqueror, but as rightful ruler. By aligning himself with Egyptian religion, he secured the loyalty of the priesthood, who wielded immense influence. For Alexander, this was not mere ceremony. He understood the power of symbols, the way religion could bind peoples to his rule. To be pharaoh was not only to command soldiers, but to embody divine kingship. It was here, in Egypt, that his image began to shift from heroic conqueror to something greater, a figure of divine destiny. It was during his time in Egypt that Alexander founded the city that would bear his name for centuries, Alexandria. Situated on the coast by the western branch of the Nile, near the island of Pharos, the site offered a natural harbour and a position ideal for trade and naval power. Alexander himself chose the location and sketched the plan, according to tradition marking out the city's boundaries with barley flour. The design was ambitious, with a great grid of streets, harbours, temples, and eventually the famous library and lighthouse that would make it a beacon of learning and commerce. Though he would never live to see it complete, Alexandria became one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a centre of Greek culture and Egyptian heritage fused together, a symbol of the new order he was creating. In founding it, Alexander demonstrated not only his military genius, but his vision for lasting empire, cities that would outlive him, carrying his name and influence across continents. Yet perhaps the most remarkable episode of his Egyptian sojourn was his journey into the desert to consult the oracle of Ammon at Siwa. Ammon, a god identified by the Greeks with Zeus, was revered as a source of divine revelation. The Oasis lay far into the Libyan desert, a place of isolation and mystery, and the journey was perilous. Alexander undertook it with determination, leading a small party across burning sands. According to later accounts, when his group lost their way, sudden rains or guiding birds led them onward, signs interpreted as divine favor. At last, he reached the temple of Ammon, where the priests greeted him not as mortal king, but as son of the god. What precisely was said remains uncertain, shrouded in ambiguity, but Alexander emerged convinced that he was more than human. The oracle's words, or perhaps his interpretation of them, confirmed him as son of Zeus, Ammon, destined to rule the world. Whether his men believed this fully or not, the aura around him deepened. He was no longer merely Alexander of Macedonia. He was Alexander the Divine, chosen by the gods, a figure whose authority transcended mortal limits. This claim to divinity did not alienate his army, for he presented it with care. He did not demand worship, but he allowed the idea to grow, feeding the legend. His men, who had seen him survive wounds, illness, and countless battles, who had watched cities fall before him as though by fate, found it easy to believe he was touched by something beyond ordinary men. For Alexander, the oracle at Siwa became a personal conviction. He had always sought to emulate Achilles, but now he believed himself not only descended from heroes, but born of the gods themselves. This belief would shape his actions, his policies, and his conception of empire as something not merely political but cosmic. By the time he left Egypt, Alexander had secured its loyalty, founded a city that would anchor his influence, and clothed himself in divine legitimacy. The Persian satraps were expelled, the temples honored, the people pacified. He had turned a land that had resisted foreign rule for centuries into a willing ally. His rear secure, he could now turn his gaze once more eastward, toward the heart of Persia. Darius had regrouped and was assembling another vast army. The confrontation between them was inevitable, a clash not merely of kings but of empires. Alexander left Egypt not as a conqueror passing through, but as a ruler established, a pharaoh, a founder, a son of the gods. The land of the Nile had welcomed him, and in return he had given it a new city, a new order, and a place in his growing vision of a world united under his name. Egypt marked the midpoint of Alexander's journey, the moment when his conquest ceased to be simply a Greek campaign of vengeance and became something larger, more universal. At Issus he had broken Darius' power, at Tyre he had shattered resistance, and in Egypt he had claimed both divine sanction and the mantle of empire builder. He left behind monuments and myths, and carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. Ahead lay Gaugamela, Babylon, and the throne of Persia itself, but in Egypt the conqueror had glimpsed another role, that of world ruler, chosen by heaven, remembered forever. It was in the sands of Siwa and the foundations of Alexandria that Alexander's legend grew beyond the man, setting him on a course not only to conquer, but to reshape the ancient world. When Alexander marched out of Egypt in 331 BCE, he did so as a man transformed. He had been hailed as Pharaoh, recognized as the son of Ammon, and had left behind him a city that bore his name. His army followed not merely a king, but a figure who carried the aura of destiny. Yet for all the glory of Egypt, the true heart of the Persian Empire still lay before him. Darius had not been broken by Issus, not entirely. He had fled, regrouped, and summoned once more the colossal resources of his empire. Across the plains of Mesopotamia, a host was gathering that dwarfed any Alexander had yet faced. If Issus had been the prelude, the battle now approaching would be the climax, the confrontation at Gaugamela, where the fate of Persia would be decided. The march northward from Egypt carried Alexander back through Syria and across the Euphrates into Mesopotamia. His scouts brought constant reports of the Persian preparations. Darius had chosen his ground carefully, a broad plain near the village of Gaugamela, wide enough to deploy his vast numbers and his scythe chariots. Persian engineers had even leveled the ground to maximize the effectiveness of their chariots, whose blades, fixed to their wheels, could scythe through dense ranks of infantry. Estimates of the Persian army's size vary wildly, inflated by ancient writers eager to magnify Alexander's achievement. But even by conservative reckoning it outnumbered the Macedonians several times over. Cavalry from across the empire, infantry from Babylon to India, elephants, and the splendor of the great king's court accompanied the host. Darius himself, once again, would be at its center, surrounded by his guards, determined to redeem his earlier flight. For Alexander, the challenge was immense. He commanded perhaps 47,000 men. Disciplined and seasoned, but dwarfed by the Persian mass, he knew that he could not win by numbers or weight of arms. Victory would depend on precision, discipline, and his own ability to strike where the enemy was weakest. As he approached the battlefield, he reconnoitered the terrain carefully, refusing to fight until he had studied every feature. His generals urged him to attack at night, hoping to disrupt the Persians before they were prepared, but Alexander refused. He declared that he would not steal victory in darkness, but win it openly, so that the world would see the triumph of his courage and his gods. It was a gesture of supreme confidence, but also a calculated stroke of psychology. By refusing the cover of night, he inspired his men with the conviction that their cause was unshakable, that their king did not fear the vast host waiting for them. On the morning of the battle, Alexander rode before his army, addressing them with words that blended inspiration with calculation. He reminded them of their victories at Granicus and Issus, of the cities they had taken, of the wealth and glory already won. He told them that beyond this battle lay the treasures of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the heart of the empire. He spoke not only of plunder but of destiny, of their place in history as the men who had followed him to greatness. His voice carried authority born of example, for they had seen him fight at their side, bleed in battle, share their hardships. When he raised his arm, their cheers rolled across the plain, defiant against the overwhelming numbers that faced them. The battle began with the Macedonian phalanx advancing steadily in the center. while Alexander led the companion cavalry on the right. Darius' army surged forward, unleashing his scythe chariots in a thunderous charge. The sight must have been terrifying, horses galloping, wheels flashing with blades meant to cut men in half. Yet Alexander had prepared his men with calm instructions. As the chariots approached, the phalanx opened lanes, letting the vehicles pass harmlessly through, while javelins and spears cut down the horses and drivers. The chariots, designed to break the enemy's line, found themselves trapped and destroyed. What had been intended as a decisive blow became a futile spectacle. Meanwhile, the Persian cavalry pressed heavily against the Macedonian left, threatening to outflank them. The fighting there was desperate, the outcome uncertain. Alexander, however, held his nerve. He saw that Darius, eager to encircle the Macedonians, had stretched his line too far. A gap opened between the Persian center and left. In that moment, Alexander acted with the speed and audacity that defined his genius. Leading the companion cavalry in a wedge formation, he hurled himself into the gap, cutting deep toward the Persian center. The phalanx, grinding forward, pinned the Persians, while Alexander's charge drove straight at the great king himself. The sight of Alexander bearing down on him was too much for Darius. Once again, the Persian king's nerve broke. Surrounded by his guards, he abandoned his chariot and fled on horseback, leaving behind his standard, his treasures, and his army. The effect was catastrophic. The Persian center dissolved in panic, and though parts of the army fought bravely on the flanks, the momentum had shifted irreversibly. Alexander might have pursued Darius at once, but news reached him that his left wing, under Parmenion, was struggling against the Persian cavalry. Torn between the pursuit of the great king and the survival of his army, he chose loyalty to his men. He wheeled his cavalry back, relieved Parmenion, and secured the field. Darius escaped, but his empire was shattered. The Macedonians had won a victory so complete that it marked the end of Persia as a world power. The battlefield of Gaugamela was strewn with the dead, the Persian losses immense. Alexander stood amid the wreckage, hailed by his men as king not only of Macedonia, but of Asia. The wealth of the Persian Empire now lay open before him. He marched first to Babylon, the ancient city of Mesopotamia, where the gates were opened to him without resistance. The priests and nobles welcomed him, seeing in him not a destroyer but a new ruler. Alexander, in turn, respected the temples, offered sacrifices to Marduk, and presented himself as heir to the traditions of Mesopotamia. It was a policy that would characterize his conquests. He did not merely crush, he absorbed, taking on the symbols of kingship in every land he entered. From Babylon he moved to Susa, another royal city where immense treasures awaited. The wealth stored there, accumulated over generations of Persian kings, was seized and distributed. Alexander rewarded his men with lavish gifts, ensuring their loyalty and binding them to his cause. Yet he was not content with gold alone. He pressed on to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, the city that symbolized the splendor and pride of the Achaemenid dynasty. The journey was harsh, through mountain passes where Persian defenders attempted to delay him, but nothing could halt the momentum of his advance. At last, Persepolis lay before him, its palaces and terraces glittering in the sun. The sack of Persepolis was one of the most dramatic moments of Alexander's campaign. The city, once the heart of Persian majesty, was looted, its treasures carried off, its people subjected to the conqueror's will. According to some accounts, Alexander at first intended to preserve it as a symbol of his rule, but in the end it was burned, its palaces consumed by fire. The reasons remain debated. Some say it was a deliberate act of revenge for the burning of Athens a century and a half earlier, a final gesture of Greek triumph over Persia. Others claim it was a drunken decision, encouraged by the courtesan Thadars during a banquet. Whatever the cause, the flames consumed the city, reducing it to ruins that still smolder in history. The destruction of Persepolis was not merely the end of a city, it was the end of an empire. The Achaemenid dynasty, once rulers of the greatest dominion the world had known, had been humiliated and broken. From its ashes rose the empire of Alexander, yet Darius still lived. he had fled eastward, seeking to raise another army to rally the remnants of his dominion. Alexander pursued him relentlessly, determined to capture or kill the man who remained a symbol of resistance. The chase carried him through the heart of Persia, across mountains and deserts, ever eastward into the lands of Media and beyond. At each step, Alexander took the trappings of kingship, wearing Persian robes, adopting Persian customs, presenting himself not merely as conqueror but as successor. This policy unsettled some of his Macedonian companions, who saw in it a dangerous blurring of Greek and barbarian. But Alexander was no longer thinking in narrow terms. His vision was of a universal monarchy, an empire that fused east and west, with himself at its center as ruler ordained by gods. In the end, Darius did not fall to Alexander's sword but to betrayal. His own satrap, Bessus, seized him, hoping to claim power by presenting himself as the avenger of Persia. Wounded and abandoned, Darius was found by Alexander's men dying in a cart. When Alexander reached him, the great king was already gone. According to tradition, Alexander covered his body with his cloak and wept, lamenting that he had not been able to face him again in honorable battle. He sent his corpse to Persepolis for burial with royal honors, presenting himself as the heir who would succeed rather than obliterate. It was a gesture of respect, but also of calculation. By honoring Darius, he positioned himself as legitimate ruler of Persia, not just a foreign invader. With Darius dead, Alexander's conquest of Persia was complete. He was hailed as king of Asia, ruler of lands stretching from Greece to the Indus, master of the greatest empire yet assembled. At Gaugamela, he had achieved the pinnacle of military triumph. In Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, he had taken the treasures and symbols of power. With the death of Darius, he had extinguished the dynasty that had ruled for centuries. The apex of conquest had been reached. Yet for Alexander, there was no thought of rest. Beyond Persia lay new lands, new peoples, new challenges. His ambition was insatiable, his vision limitless. The boy who had dreamed of Achilles now stood as greater than Achilles, not only a warrior of glory, but a ruler of worlds. But with greatness came new strains, the need to govern, to reconcile Macedonians with Persians, to balance conquest with rule. The fire that had carried him to the heights would drive him still further, but it would also burn all who came too close. With Darius dead and the Persian throne his by right of conquest, Alexander might have been expected to rest upon his laurels, to consolidate his hold over the lands that stretched from the Aegean to the Zagros mountains. Yet rest was never in his nature. Victory at Gaugamela, the treasures of Babylon, the flames of Persepolis, and the burial of the great king had not satisfied him. They had only whetted his hunger. His vision was no longer limited to the empire of Persia. He imagined a dominion without borders, stretching into the unknown lands of Central Asia and beyond. The pursuit of Darius had already carried him far to the east, into Media and Parthia, and with the king's death, he chose not to turn back but to press on. To him, unfinished conquest was intolerable, and the regions of Bactria and Sogdiana, wild and rebellious, were to be brought under his command. The march into these lands was unlike anything Alexander or his men had faced before. Persia had offered cities of splendor, roads paved with stone, and wealth ready to be seized. Central Asia offered mountains, deserts, and a fierce people who refused to submit. The terrain itself was the enemy, a vast expanse of jagged peaks, searing heat by day and biting cold by night, rivers that flooded in spring and ran dry in summer. It was the edge of the known world, a place where Greek maps dissolved into myth. To the Macedonians, accustomed to fertile plains and walled cities, this was a nightmare landscape. Yet Alexander, relentless, drove them forward. Each step into the wilderness seemed to carry him further from Greece, further from the familiar, and deeper into a vision of empire that no longer resembled his father's dream, but something entirely his own. The campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana were not battles in the style of Issus or Gaugamela, where two armies clashed on open ground. They were wars of ambushes, raids, and sieges, a grinding struggle against elusive foes. The satrap Bessus, who had betrayed Darius and proclaimed himself king in the eastern provinces, rallied resistance among the local tribes. Alexander pursued him ruthlessly, determined to punish the treachery and establish his own legitimacy as ruler of Persia. Yet Bessus was no easy prey. He retreated deeper into the wilds, burning bridges, destroying supplies, using the land itself as his ally. Alexander followed, leading his men through mountain passes and across frozen rivers, enduring hardships that would have broken lesser armies. When at last Bessus was betrayed by his own allies and captured, Alexander had him mutilated and executed in the Persian manner, his nose and ears cut away before being crucified. It was a brutal punishment, but Alexander intended it as a signal that he would uphold Persian traditions of kingship as much as Macedonian. By avenging Darius in Persian style, he presented himself not only as conqueror, but as rightful successor. But conquest did not end with Bessus. The regions of Bactria and Sogdiana were filled with fortresses perched upon cliffs, defended by peoples who refused to submit. Alexander laid siege to them one by one, often scaling sheer rock faces under cover of night, driving his men to feats of endurance that bordered on the impossible. In one famous episode, he surrounded the So, called Sogdian Rock, a fortress high upon a crag, whose defenders laughed that Alexander would need men with wings to capture it. Alexander, enraged, called for volunteers among his climbers, promising great rewards. With tent pegs and ropes, a small band of soldiers scaled the cliffs in the dead of night, reaching the summit at dawn. When the defenders awoke to see Macedonians on the heights above them, they surrendered in disbelief. It was not merely a victory of arms but of audacity, the kind of impossible feat that became legend among his men. During these campaigns, Alexander's policy of integration grew more pronounced. He could not simply crush every tribe and fortress, for resistance would never end. Instead, he sought to win loyalty by blending cultures, taking Persian nobles into his service, marrying into local dynasties, and encouraging his officers to do the same. It was in Bactria that he took as wife Roxina, the daughter of a local nobleman. The marriage was both political and personal. Roxina was famed for her beauty, and Alexander was captivated by her. But it was also a gesture of conciliation, binding a powerful local family to his rule. For his Macedonian companions, however, this was another troubling sign. They grumbled at his adoption of Persian dress, his prostrations before Eastern customs, his willingness to treat former enemies as equals. To them, Alexander was drifting from his identity as a Macedonian king and becoming something alien, a monarch who sought to fuse Greek and barbarian into a new whole. Yet Alexander pressed on, convinced that his vision of a universal empire demanded such unions. The resistance in these regions, however, was not easily quelled. Guerrilla warfare dragged on for years, with tribes retreating into the mountains and striking at his supply lines. Alexander responded with relentless campaigns, marching in winter through snows, building forts to secure territory, resettling populations to weaken rebellion. His men suffered terribly, far from home, worn down by endless fighting in hostile terrain. Yet his presence kept them going. He shared their hardships, riding at the front, enduring the same cold and hunger. He rewarded them lavishly when victories were won, distributing wealth seized from fortresses, reminding them that the hardships of today would be repaid with glory and riches tomorrow. It was also during these campaigns that Alexander's ruthlessness grew more evident. Suspicion gnawed at him, especially when conspiracies were uncovered. One of the most famous incidents was the execution of Philotas, the son of his trusted general Parmenion. Accused of failing to reveal a plot against Alexander's life, Philotas was tortured and executed. His father, though far away, was also put to death, lest he seek vengeance. To many, this was shocking, a betrayal of one of Philip's most loyal commanders. Yet Alexander believed no half measures could be tolerated. Any hint of disloyalty had to be crushed, even among his closest companions. The empire he was building could not rest upon divided loyalties. Despite the brutality, Alexander also showed a remarkable ability to win over those who once resisted him. He recruited local horsemen into his army, valuing their skill in the difficult terrain. He married his Macedonian officers to noble women of the East, binding them by blood to their new lands. Slowly, painfully, he transformed these wild provinces into part of his empire. Yet the cost was high in lives, in exhaustion, and in the growing alienation of his old comrades, who felt he was leaving behind the simplicity of their cause as Greeks avenging themselves on Persia. They had marched to punish, to plunder, and to win glory, but now they found themselves fighting endless wars in desolate lands, asked to bow before foreign customs, and embrace people they had once despised. The tension between Alexander's vision and his men's expectations grew sharper with every mile eastward. Still, the legend of Alexander only grew. Stories of his impossible feats spread the scaling of the Sogdian rock, the marriage to the beautiful Roxina, the founding of new cities that bore his name. Each city was a symbol of permanence, a promise that his empire was not fleeting conquest, but lasting dominion. He founded Alexandrias throughout the east, settlements that would anchor Greek culture in foreign soil. They were military colonies, trading hubs, and monuments to his ambition, spreading the Hellenistic world far beyond its old boundaries. By the time the campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana drew to a close, Alexander had transformed not only the map but himself. He was no longer simply the conqueror of Persia. He was ruler of lands that Greece had never known, husband to a Bactrian princess, lord of peoples who spoke languages his men could not understand. He wore Persian robes, sat on a Persian throne, demanded honors once reserved for Eastern monarchs. To some he seemed a god, to others a tyrant. But to all he was a man who could not be stopped. The trials of Central Asia, harsher than any set peace battle, revealed his endurance, his adaptability, and his willingness to bend both himself and his men to the demands of empire. Yet beneath the victories, the strains were growing. His men were wary, suspicious of his eastern ways, resentful of the endless campaigning. Alexander's own temper, once fiery but controlled, grew harsher, more unpredictable, as he demanded obedience and lashed out at perceived disloyalty. The dream of a universal empire was becoming reality, but it was also becoming a burden. Central Asia had not broken him, but it had changed him. From the boy who had sought to emulate Achilles, he had become something larger and stranger, a king of kings, a unifier of worlds, and a man who believed himself touched by divinity. As he finally turned his eyes southward toward India, leaving behind the mountains and deserts of Bactria and Sogdiana, Alexander carried with him not only an empire extended to its furthest limits, but also the scars of unending struggle. The marriage to Roxina, the brutal executions, the endless sieges, the mixture of cultures, all of these marked a new phase of his rule. The conquests were no longer about Greece and Persia alone, but about a world reshaped in his image. The journey into Central Asia had tested him more severely than any battlefield, and he had emerged both triumphant and transformed. What awaited him beyond the Hindu Kush would test him still further, in ways neither he nor his weary soldiers could yet imagine. By the time Alexander turned his eyes toward India, he had already marched further than any Macedonian or Greek could have imagined. He had crossed Asia Minor, broken the Persian kings, burned Persepolis, and forced the wild highlands of Central Asia to kneel. Yet, for all the victories behind him, his ambition had not dimmed. Instead, it had grown with each conquest. The lands beyond the Hindu Kush were spoken of in half legendary terms, fertile valleys and mighty rivers where kings ruled over elephants and armies of exotic warriors. To Alexander, the campaign into India was not only an extension of conquest, but the next step toward a universal empire. He had begun his journey claiming vengeance for Greece, but now he sought nothing less than dominion over the edge of the known world. The march into India began in 327 BCE. To reach it, Alexander had to cross the Hindu Kush, mountains as formidable as any his men had yet endured. The passes were narrow, the air thin, and the snows brutal. Supplies were scarce, and soldiers accustomed to plains and deserts struggled to breathe in the frozen heights. Yet Alexander drove them forward, encouraging them with promises of the wealth of India, the treasures that lay beyond. When they descended at last into the valleys of the Indus, the change was astonishing. The land was lush, green with rice fields and dotted with new fruits and spices. The rivers were wide, their currents swift, unlike anything the Greeks had known. It was a world foreign to them, strange and alluring, and yet another challenge to conquer. Resistance came swiftly. The first opposition was from tribes who lived in fortified towns along the mountain valleys. They fought with tenacity, ambushing the Macedonian columns, firing arrows from high cliffs, retreating into strongholds that seemed impregnable. In one siege, Alexander himself led the assault up ladders against a fortress wall, climbing despite a storm of missiles. An arrow pierced his armor and lodged in his chest, and he was forced to leap down, nearly collapsing from the wound. Yet even injured, he rallied his men, and when the stronghold fell, the defenders were slaughtered as a warning. His determination, his willingness to risk his life in the thick of battle, inspired loyalty, but it also showed a growing recklessness. He seemed convinced that nothing could kill him, that he was truly invincible, as the oracle of Ammon had declared. As Alexander moved deeper into India, he encountered rulers willing to submit and others determined to resist. Some cities opened their gates, offering tribute and gifts. Others were besieged and burned. In each case, Alexander demanded recognition not only as conqueror but as king. He established garrisons, founded new cities bearing his name, and sought to weave these distant lands into the fabric of his empire. Yet the challenges multiplied. The climate was oppressive, the rains heavy, and the rivers unlike any they had seen. To cross them required ingenuity and relentless effort, as Alexander's engineers built rafts and pontoons, or lashed together boats from whatever materials they could find. Each crossing was a battle with nature itself. The greatest test of the Indian campaign came in 326 BCE, at the Battle of the Hydaspes. On the far side of the river Hydaspes stood King Porus, ruler of a powerful realm. Porus was no petty chieftain, but a monarch with a disciplined army and a fearsome weapon unknown to the Macedonians, war elephants. With their massive bulk, tusks capped with iron, and the terror they inspired in horses, the elephants presented a challenge unlike anything Alexander had faced before. Porus arrayed his forces along the far bank, confident that the swollen river would protect him. To attack across such a barrier seemed impossible, yet Alexander was determined to force the crossing and crush his foe. For days, the two armies faced each other across the river, Porus shadowing every movement, Alexander searching for a way to outwit him. At last, in a stormy night, Alexander led a picked force upriver, moving silently through the rain. He found a crossing point, ferried his men across, and by dawn had established a bridgehead on the far bank. Porus, caught off guard, rushed to meet him, his elephants and cavalry thundering forward. The battle that followed was one of the most ferocious of Alexander's career. The elephants charged trampling men, tearing through ranks, their riders hurling javelins. Horses panicked at their smell, breaking formation. Yet Alexander adapted quickly, ordering his men to attack the elephants' legs, to wound them until they turned in confusion. The phalanx held firm, surrounding the beasts and cutting them down one by one. Meanwhile, Alexander himself led his cavalry in sweeping maneuvers, striking at Porus' flanks. The fighting raged for hours, the ground soaked with blood, until at last the Indian army broke. Porus, towering on his elephant, fought bravely to the end, refusing to flee. When he was finally captured, Alexander was impressed by his dignity. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied simply, "Like a king." Struck by his courage, Alexander restored him to his throne, making him an ally rather than a vassal. It was a gesture both magnanimous and pragmatic, for Alexander knew that holding such vast territories would be impossible without loyal local rulers. The Battle of the Hydaspes was costly, but it cemented his reputation as invincible. He had faced elephants, the terror of the East, and triumphed. His men, however, saw the cost. Thousands lay dead, and they began to wonder how much further this march into the unknown would go. After Hydaspes, Alexander pressed further eastward, founding new cities, subduing more tribes. He dreamed of reaching the great river Ganges, beyond which he imagined yet another world to conquer. Tales reached him of kingdoms with armies larger still, of elephants in the tens of thousands. His ambition burned undimmed, but his men's resolve was breaking. They had marched thousands of miles, through deserts, mountains, and rivers, fighting without end. The rains of India soaked them to the bone, the strange food and water weakened them, and the thought of still greater battles ahead filled them with dread. At last, on the banks of the Issus River, his army mutinied. They refused to go further. Coaxing, threats, and promises failed. They were loyal to him, but they would not march into endless war. They demanded to turn back. For the first time, Alexander's will was checked. He raged, shut himself in his tent, refusing to see anyone, hoping that his sulking would sway them. But the army held firm. Finally, after days of silence, he emerged and conceded. He would not drag unwilling men into further conquest. Instead, he ordered 12 great altars to be built on the banks of the river, dedicated to the gods, as monuments marking the furthest extent of his journey. It was both a concession and a symbolic claim, as though to say he had reached the end of the world and left his mark upon it. The army turned back, but the legend of the march east remained. The return was as brutal as the advance. Alexander divided his forces, some taking a river route down the Indus, others marching overland. Along the way, he faced fierce resistance from tribes who attacked his columns, forcing constant battles. In one assault on a fortified town, Alexander led the attack himself, scaling a wall under a hail of arrows. He was struck in the chest by a shaft that pierced his lung, and he collapsed, bleeding and near death. His men believed he was finished, and despair spread through the camp. Yet Alexander, even in agony, refused to yield. He allowed himself to be carried on a stretcher before the army, raising his hand in defiance, proving that he still lived. The sight restored their spirits, though his body bore the scar of yet another reckless act of courage. At last, after months of fighting, the Macedonians reached the sea. But the return journey did not end there. Alexander resolved to march his army westward through the Gedrosian desert, a decision that became one of the most punishing ordeals of the entire expedition. The desert was vast, barren, and merciless. Supplies failed, water was scarce, and men collapsed in the heat. Thousands perished, their bones bleaching under the sun. Even Alexander, sharing their hardships, could not shield them from the suffering. At one point, when a helmet full of water was offered to him, he poured it onto the ground in front of his men, refusing to drink what they could not share. The gesture inspired them, but it did not ease their torment. By the time they emerged from the desert, the army was a shadow of what it had been. The Indian campaign had brought Alexander both glory and pain. At Hydaspes, he had defeated a powerful king and faced elephants with courage. He had extended his empire further east than any Greek or Persian had ever dreamed. He had founded new cities, secured alliances, and demonstrated both ruthlessness and magnanimity. Yet it had also shown the limits of conquest. His men had refused him, his body had been scarred, and the desert had devoured thousands. The vision of reaching the ends of the earth had been checked, and though Alexander returned westward, still a conqueror, he carried with him the first taste of frustration, the realization that even he could not bend all of reality to his will. As he re-entered the Persian heartlands, he was greeted not only as king but as a figure almost divine, ruler of an empire stretching from Greece to India. Yet within him burned the same restless fire, the refusal to stop, the dream of yet more to achieve. India had tested him as no other land had, and though he had triumphed, it had also revealed cracks in his army's loyalty, in his body's endurance, and in the fragile balance of his vision. He had gone further than Achilles, further than Cyrus, further than any mortal before him. But the world was vast, and Alexander was not yet ready to accept that there might be an end to his conquest. When Alexander finally turned his weary army westward from the frontiers of India, he did so not as a man retreating in defeat, but as one redirecting the course of conquest. The decision to halt at the Hyphasis had not been his. It had been forced upon him by the exhaustion and rebellion of his men. Yet even in conceding, Alexander had turned the moment into a symbolic triumph, leaving monuments to the gods and claiming to have reached the ends of the earth. Still, the march back was brutal. The crossing of the Gedrosian desert broke his army more savagely than any battle. Men collapsed from thirst, whole columns withered in the sands, and beasts of burden died by the thousands. Yet through it all Alexander endured with them, sharing their hunger, their thirst, and their grief. By the time he emerged, scarred but alive, he had won not only their loyalty but their awe. No king had ever driven men so far, into such desolation, and survived. Once he re-entered the Persian heartlands, the character of his campaign shifted. Conquest was no longer the chief aim. Alexander had already subdued the great empire, taken its capitals, and broken its dynasty. What remained was the harder task of governance, to bind together a realm stretching from Greece to India, filled with peoples of countless languages, faiths, and traditions. It was here, in the years after the Indian expedition, that Alexander revealed the fullness of his vision. He did not seek to rule as a Macedonian king over conquered barbarians. He sought to create something new, a fusion of Greek and Persian, East and West, in a single universal empire with himself as its living center. The policies he pursued shocked many of his Macedonian companions. He began to adopt Persian dress and court rituals, presenting himself in robes of splendor, receiving obeisance in the manner of the great kings. He demanded proskynesis, the act of bowing or prostration, something unthinkable to free Greeks who bowed only to gods. To Alexander, it was a way to unify customs, to place himself above distinctions of culture, as ruler of all men. To his veterans, it seemed arrogance, even sacrilege. Murmurs spread in the camp, resentment brewing among men who had followed him as a comrade, king, and now found themselves commanded to treat him as divine. Alexander pressed on regardless, convinced that his empire could not survive without blending traditions, without elevating his own person to a status that transcended cultural divisions. One of his boldest steps was the mass marriage ceremony at Susa in 324 BCE. There, in a grand spectacle, Alexander took as wife Statira, a daughter of Darius, while Roxana remained his earlier bride. His closest companions were paired with Persian noblewomen, and thousands of Macedonian soldiers were married to women from the east. The marriages were meant to fuse peoples by blood, to create a new generation loyal not to one side or the other, but to the empire itself. The ceremony was lavish, filled with music, feasting, and ritual, a symbolic union of East and West. Yet beneath the grandeur lay discontent. Many Macedonians saw it as a betrayal, the dilution of their culture, the loss of their distinct identity as conquerors. Few of the marriages endured after Alexander's death, but in that moment they embodied his vision of a world united under one name. At the same time, Alexander continued to reorganize his empire's administration. He placed Persians in high offices alongside Macedonians, training them in military and civil duties. He encouraged his officers to accept Eastern ways, rewarding those who embraced the blending of customs. He raised new units of Persian soldiers, drilling them in Macedonian tactics, calling them his successors. To his veterans, this was a shocking innovation, as though their years of loyalty were being set aside in favor of foreign recruits. Resentment turned to mutiny in 324 BCE, when the Macedonians at Opis, insulted by the favor shown to Persians, refused to follow him. Alexander's response was swift and terrifying. He arrested the ringleaders, executed them, and dismissed thousands of his veterans on the spot, sending them back to Macedonia. Then, in a display of calculated emotion, he confronted the army, reminding them of all he had given and all they had achieved together. He wept, accusing them of abandoning him. The men, overcome with guilt, begged for forgiveness. Alexander reinstated them with theatrical generosity, but the message was clear: his authority was absolute, and his vision of a unified empire would not be denied. Yet even as he pursued fusion, he remained ruthless in crushing opposition. The conspiracies of his companions haunted him. The execution of Philotas and the assassination of Parmenion had already marked a turning point, but further plots emerged. Callisthenes, the historian who had criticized his demand for proskynesis, was arrested and executed on suspicion of treason. Clitus the Black, one of his closest officers, and the man who had saved his life at the Granicus, was killed by Alexander's own hand during a drunken quarrel. The horror of that act weighed on him deeply, for Clitus had been a loyal comrade, and his death revealed the growing fissures between Alexander and those who had marched with him from the beginning. Increasingly, the king stood alone, his vision incomprehensible to many of his oldest friends. Even in governance, Alexander never ceased planning new campaigns. He spoke of conquering Arabia, sending ships to explore its coasts, mapping routes for future invasions. He dreamed of pushing further west, perhaps even into Carthage, perhaps beyond. His ambition had no limit, for he believed himself chosen not merely to rule, but to transform the world. He founded more cities, left more garrisons, planted the seeds of Hellenistic culture in lands that had never before seen Greece. Everywhere he went, he was both conqueror and founder, destroyer and creator, stamping his name upon geography itself. The return to Babylon in 323 BCE was both triumphant and ominous. The city welcomed him as king, its temples adorned, its priests eager to align themselves with his power. Alexander entered not as an invader but as a ruler, planning to make it his capital, the seat of his universal empire. From Babylon he sent out orders to explore Arabia, to prepare fleets, to organize new campaigns. He held court with splendor, surrounded by Macedonians and Persians alike, a cosmopolitan image of his vision. Yet the strain was visible. His body bore the scars of countless battles, his mind the weight of suspicion and ambition. Banquets grew more lavish. Drinking heavier, his temper more volatile. He was a man who had achieved everything, yet still sought more, as though he feared that to stop moving would be to cease existing. It was in Babylon that Alexander began to sense his own mortality. Omens abounded. Strange birds fell dead in the temple. The walls echoed with cries. The augurs muttered of ill fortune. He ignored them, as he always had, but the shadow of fate hung heavy. Still he planned, still he dreamed, still he reached for horizons beyond sight. The marriages at Susa, the incorporation of Persians into his army, the new campaigns he envisioned, these were not the acts of a man ready to settle into rule. They were the acts of one who believed his destiny infinite. Yet his men, his companions, and even his own body could not keep pace with the fire that consumed him. By the time he returned to Babylon, Alexander was at the height of his power. He ruled an empire stretching from Greece to India, greater than any before him. He had fused peoples, toppled dynasties, and created cities that would endure for centuries. Yet he was also increasingly isolated, feared as much as loved, his vision incomprehensible to many, his humanity consumed by the divinity he claimed. The return was not the closing of a circle, but the gathering of forces for something greater still. He believed that the world still waited to be conquered, that his task was not complete, but fate was moving against him. The empire was vast, but its foundations were fragile. The king was mighty, but he was still mortal. Babylon would be the center of his new world, but it would also be the stage of his end. In the spring of 323 BCE, Alexander returned to Babylon, the city he intended to make the heart of his empire. The great capital of Mesopotamia, with its towering walls, broad avenues, and temples dedicated to Marduk, seemed the perfect seat for a ruler who sought to bind east and west into one. Here, the conqueror who had marched from Macedonia through Asia Minor, Persia, Central Asia, and India would establish his universal monarchy. Yet even as preparations for new campaigns filled the air, shadows gathered around him. He had lived as if destiny itself bent to his will, but in Babylon he would discover that no man, however great, could conquer death. The city welcomed him with splendor. Delegations came from every corner of his empire: Greeks, Persians, Babylonians, Indians, Egyptians, Scythians, and envoys from lands beyond. Even distant Italians and Carthaginians are said to have sent representatives curious about the man who had redrawn the world's map. Babylon became a festival of nations, its streets alive with music, feasts, and ceremonies. Alexander presided over it all with the aura of a living god. He held audiences in Persian robes, received obeisance from nobles, and walked through the city as both conqueror and king. Yet beneath the magnificence ran currents of tension. His Macedonian veterans still grumbled at his Eastern customs, his officers whispered of conspiracies, and rumors spread of omens foretelling doom. Despite the grandeur, Alexander was restless. He was only 32, and though he had achieved more than any man before him, he spoke ceaselessly of new campaigns. Arabia was next on his horizon. He had already dispatched fleets to explore its coasts, planning a grand invasion that would extend his dominion to the very edges of the known world. Some said he even dreamed of circling westward, striking Carthage, or pushing north into Europe, creating a ring of conquest that would enclose all lands in his grasp. To Alexander, standing still was unthinkable. Life was movement, conquest, expansion. Without new horizons, he was like Achilles without war, a hero condemned to idleness. But the gods or fate or chance had other plans. The first signs came as whispers of ill omen. Strange portents unsettled Babylon. Ravens fell dead at his feet. A lion escaped and was killed in the palace, and the temple priests warned of dire prophecies. Alexander, though superstitious in his own way, brushed aside such warnings. He had defied omens before, and victory had followed. Yet even he seemed unsettled when one of his generals, as he entered Babylon, dreamed of a man sitting upon Alexander's throne dressed in his robes and wearing his diadem. To some, it was an omen that the king's reign was near its end. To others, a sign that his glory was about to ascend beyond mortal bounds. Soon after his arrival, Alexander threw himself into preparations for his Arabian campaign. He reviewed troops, planned logistics, and oversaw naval constructions. The city buzzed with activity, its harbours alive with the sound of shipwrights. Yet amidst the energy of preparation, a sense of exhaustion clung to him. Years of ceaseless campaigning, endless wounds, and the burdens of rule weighed upon his body. He had been struck by arrows, spears, and stones, carried scars across his chest and limbs, endured sickness in strange lands, and driven himself far beyond ordinary limits. Now, in Babylon's heavy heat, his strength faltered. At the end of May 323 BCE, after a long day of drinking at a banquet in honor of his companion Medius, Alexander fell ill. At first it seemed nothing unusual, for fevers were common in Mesopotamia, carried by the swamps and rivers. He complained of weakness and a burning thirst, yet continued to direct his plans, refusing to rest. Over the following days, however, his condition worsened. His fever climbed, his body shook with chills, and he struggled to rise from his bed. Still he demanded to be carried to the sacrifices, to oversee rituals, to remain visible to his men. The sight of their king weakened, but defiance stirred his soldiers, yet also filled them with unease. Alexander had always seemed more than mortal. To see him broken by sickness unsettled the illusion of invincibility. The illness dragged on for nearly 2 weeks. Each day he grew weaker, his voice fading, his body wasting. Rumors spread through the camp that he had been poisoned. Some accused Antipater, left as regent in Macedonia, of plotting against him. Others whispered of generals jealous of his power. Poison was a familiar explanation in antiquity, but modern minds suspect malaria or typhoid, diseases bred in Babylon's marshes. Whatever the cause, the effect was the same. The greatest conqueror of the age lay dying, his companions powerless to save him. As his condition declined, Alexander's generals pressed him for instructions. Who would succeed him? How would the empire be governed? But he gave no clear answer. Some accounts say that when asked to whom he left his kingdom, he whispered, "To the strongest." Others claim he gave his signet ring to Perdiccas, suggesting him as successor. Still others insist he was too weak to speak at all, leaving only ambiguity. Perhaps he deliberately refused to name a single heir, knowing that no man could replace him, forcing his generals to struggle among themselves. Or perhaps death came too swiftly, denying him the chance to shape the future. Whatever the truth, the silence left behind would tear the empire apart. One of the most poignant scenes came at the end. His soldiers, desperate to see their king one last time, demanded to be admitted to his chamber. Too weak to rise, Alexander was carried on his bed through the lines, raising his hand in silent farewell. The men wept, stretching out their arms, pressing lips to the hem of his cloak. They had followed him from Macedonia to the edge of India, across deserts and mountains, through glory and despair. Now they saw him not as a god, but as a dying man, and their grief was overwhelming. Alexander's eyes, fever bright, met theirs, and though he could no longer speak, the bond between them was unbroken. On either the 10th or 11th of June, 323 BCE, Alexander breathed his last. He was 32 years old, at the height of his power, master of an empire that stretched farther than any before him. His death was met with disbelief. Some refused to accept it, claiming he had only fallen into a trance and would rise again. Others insisted he had been taken up by the gods, his body too noble for decay. In truth, his body is said to have remained uncorrupted for days, further feeding rumors of divinity. But whether mortal sickness or divine calling, Alexander was gone. His death unleashed chaos. Without a named heir, his generals, the Diadochi, the successors, turned upon one another. His wife Roxana was pregnant, and his half-brother Aridaeus lived, but neither could rule unaided. For the next 40 years, his companions fought brutal wars to carve up the empire, founding dynasties in Egypt, Asia, and Macedonia. The unity Alexander had sought dissolved almost immediately, his dream of a universal empire shattered by the ambitions of those who had once followed him. Yet even in fragmentation, his legacy endured. Greek culture spread across the East, cities he founded flourished, and the memory of his conquests shaped history for centuries. The Hellenistic age, born from his death, transformed the world. The question of his final words has haunted storytellers ever since. To the strongest, if indeed he said it, was both a challenge and a prophecy, acknowledging that only power would decide the future. Others claim he left his empire, to the best, leaving the definition deliberately vague. Still others believe he gave no words at all, leaving only silence. Perhaps the ambiguity itself was fitting. Alexander's life defied easy interpretation, and his death ensured that his legend would never belong to one man, but to all who would claim it. His funeral became legend in its own right. His body, preserved in honey, was intended for burial in Macedonia, but Ptolemy, one of his generals, seized it and brought it to Egypt. There it was laid in a golden sarcophagus in Alexandria, the city he had founded, where it remained for centuries, a shrine to his memory. Pilgrims and rulers came to see the body of the man who had changed the world. Even Julius Caesar and Augustus would stand before his tomb, paying homage to the conqueror whose shadow still loomed over all who dreamed of empire. In death, Alexander became more than a man. He became myth. To the Greeks, he was Achilles reborn, the hero who sought eternal glory and achieved it. To the Persians, he was the destroyer of their empire, yet also its successor, the king who honored Darius. To the Egyptians, he was Pharaoh, son of Ammon, divine ruler. To later ages, he was a model of ambition and tragedy, the man who won the world and lost himself. His empire fractured, but his legend endured, inspiring conquerors from Rome to Napoleon, each measuring themselves against his name. In Babylon, the city he had chosen as his capital, the conqueror of worlds lay silent. He had marched farther than any, built more than any, dreamed greater than any. At 32, he had achieved immortality, not by living forever, but by living so intensely that his story could never die. His soldiers wept, his companions fought, his empire splintered, but Alexander himself remained eternal in memory. The boy who had tamed Bucephalus, the student of Aristotle, the king who cut the Gordian knot, the conqueror of Persia, the pharaoh of Egypt, the victor of Gaugamela, the husband of Roxana, the master of half the world. He was all these, and more. His death was the end of a man, but the beginning of a legend that has never faded.